Hey there, Emmanuel here from WebDevFuel, and in this video we're going to go over the truth about clean code and how you can use clean code to become a better web developer. The first problem that we have with clean code is that it has two different meanings. We first of all have the Clean Code, the brand by Uncle Bob, which is the book that became very popular in the software engineering space. And then we have quote unquote clean code, as in code that web developers like me and you find easy to read, to write, and to maintain. And the reality is, both of these meanings are completely different. We first of all have what Uncle Bob defines as clean code, and since it became very popular, the book and all of his concepts, nowadays a lot of web developers confuse both of these things. So if I'm talking to another web developer and I mention that I want this code base to be clean, to follow clean code rules, for example, then the web developer won't know if I'm referring to clean code, the book by Uncle Bob, or clean code again, as in code that another web developer or me might see as clean or good. And this leads us into the second problem, and that is clean code by Uncle Bob, quote unquote, captured these meanings. I'm not trying to bash Uncle Bob here, and in fact, I think it was a fantastic marketing move on his part. But the reality is that quote unquote clean code by Uncle Bob is first of all very tied into the OOP philosophy. So let's imagine that Uncle Bob actually hated OOP and he thought that it was the worst thing to happen in software engineering. In that case, quote unquote clean code by Uncle Bob might have completely different rules written inside the book. For example, we should always use functional programming. But that's not the case, and because of it, a lot of rules tied to quote unquote clean code by Uncle Bob have a lot of things related to OP. Second, it is the opinion of one person. This one person, Uncle Bob, might have a lot of experience and he might know a lot of things that developers like me and you don't know. But the reality is that if you try to follow these rules that are quote unquote written in stone by another developer and it doesn't actually make you more productive, then there's no point in actually following them at all. And this ties into the last point, which is software engineering good practices are not that quote unquote written in stone. The fact of the matter is that what one team might find very productive to work with, another team might completely disagree. It is up to us as devs to define what clean code is, and if, for example, I prefer to work with functional programming, then I should do that. And if you prefer to work with OOP, then you should do that, and there's no problem with both of those decisions. Either functional programming or OOP are just tools that we should use as developers, and one is not necessarily better than the other. So for example, we have Laravel, which is a full stack framework, and it uses a lot of OOP since the language that it uses is PHP. And then we also have Phoenix Elixir that uses a lot of functional programming since the language that it uses is Elixir. And both of these projects are amazing and they are great to work with. But again, it comes down to the preference of the dev that is working with a project. So my advice to you, and what I think is the quote-unquote truth about clean code, is that we should try to write good code regardless of these definitions that were created by someone else. And maybe even create our own definitions as we progress in our ability to write code and to understand what we prefer to do inside of a code base, what makes it easier to read code, to write code, and to modify a code base. So these steps are very good if you want to improve at that. First of all, you write or read code, and then when you like or dislike something, in other words, if you find it easy or hard to work with, you should make an effort to understand why. Now, you can try to write these things down as they happen, but the important thing here is that you should try to understand when you find something inside of a code base and it is either very easy or very hard to understand, very easy to modify or very hard to modify, you should make an effort to try to understand why and sort of create your own rules, your own definitions of what good code is. But before we continue, if you want to learn more about how to build web applications with HTMX, Go, and PostgreSQL, then go to webdevfuel.com/HGSB or click the link in the description down below. And as an example, here are my rules of thumb for writing quote-unquote clean code. First of all, don't abstract too much. Always prefer repetition to early abstraction. And the reality is that for me, abstraction is very cool. It is always a very interesting problem to try to abstract something away. So I know that usually I'll want to do that more than not wanting to do it. And because of that, I always have to force myself to not abstract too much, because when I do so, the code base always becomes more complicated to work with and make changes in. Second, always prefer explicitness over good looking code. And this also ties into the reason I love Go so much, and that is because even though in Go we write a lot of boilerplate code, the code is very explicit and very easy to read after we write it. If you want to dive deeper a bit into the reasons why I think that you should learn Go, then I'm going to leave a link in the description down below to a video I've recently published on the reasons why you should learn Go. Next, preferring to write programs with Go doesn't necessarily mean that I enjoy writing or reading Go. It actually only means that when I use Go, the programs that are right are always better than when I don't. And that is again because, first of all, Go has error handling and it is also a very explicit language. But the reality is that I usually prefer Elixir or Rust. And when I say that I prefer, I mean that I prefer to read it. So I think that the language is more beautiful. Since the code looks quote unquote cooler, more concise, it has higher abstractions, and so on and so on. But this doesn't necessarily mean that I should pick always both of these languages when I'm creating a project, and I typically pick Go when I actually want to write something in production because it is a very explicit language, and although it is not the most beautiful language to write or to read, it is a very quote-unquote correct language to write correct programs, to do error handling, and all of those kinds of things. Third, make variable names as specific as the scope. And this is also why I love Go, and that is because Go doesn't necessarily use long variable names for everything. Now, there are web developers that abuse this thing, and you have projects inside the Go ecosystem that only have, let's say, for example, one variable names for everything, and I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. But what I think that Go has right is that the variable names are only as big as they need to be. So for example, when we have smaller functions, we can have 1 to 3 letter variables. So let's say that we want to compare two different strings, we can have s1 and s2. Both of those are of type string, and when we are reading the code, it is very clear what's happening there. We have the string number 1 and the string number 2, so we can have a variable with two different letters, again s1 and s2, and then we compare both of them and we return something. So it is very clear, and we don't need to name it something longer like string number 1, string number 2, or something like that. And then when we have a larger function, then we might need to have a more specific name as to not confuse, let's say, different concepts, different ideas, or different parts of the program. At that point, we might have a bunch of different strings that have different meanings. So at that point, it actually makes sense to name that variable something more specifically, and that usually requires having a longer name. And then it doesn't really make sense to only have one variable name for the variable. But like the point here says, we want to make variable names as specific as the scope. So these are three things that I sort of like to do when I'm trying to write clean code, and these are my clean code rules. Again, this is what I believe is the truth about clean code, and that is we don't need to follow other people's rules, but rather we can read those rules. I'm not saying that Clean Code by Uncle Bob is a bad book at all. I'm not saying that the concepts inside the book are bad. What I'm saying is that you should, for example, read the book, see what the concepts are, try to go search them online, and then try to see if they fit into your way of doing web development or doing programming in general. And start from there. Start from trying to see what your style is and how you prefer to write programs. So with this being said, I hope this video was helpful to you and it gave you a nice starting point of how to create your own clean code rules that you can use as you progress as a programmer. So I'll see you on the next video.